healthcare is a $4 trillion industry in the United States.
93% of Americans have health insurance, but if you have health insurance from a traditional health insurer, your plan that you're paying for is ultimately going to be funneled down into services that violate the dignity of the human person.
We could be serving, a culture of life and building a culture of life. And
that's foundational to what we're doing as the nation's first pro-life health insurance company.
You guys are building pro-life health insurance. The healthcare industry in the U.S. everyone knows is kind of crazy, insane. At best, it's a kind of a unintelligible mess of like bureaucracy. At worst, it's sort of like a grift in some cases. Why are you building pro-life insurance, and what's the broader context of healthcare in the U.S.?
Yeah. So first with the pro-life piece, obviously, that's foundational to what we're doing as the nation's first pro-life health insurance company. So primarily it's to speak to the dignity of the human person, that ultimately healthcare is supposed to heal the person, is to care for the person. That's at its ideal what it's doing. It's kind of a restorative process at its best. And obviously abortion, some of these issues, abortifacients, so things that induce abortions are the exact opposite of that. And unfortunately, 93% of Americans have health insurance, but if you have health insurance from a traditional health insurer, your plan that you're paying for is ultimately going to be funneled down into services that violate the dignity of the human person. Either they're covering abortion or abortifacients or contraception or transgender surgery as something that's emerging more and more in the healthcare space. So primarily, we believe that health insurance should reflect the dignity of the human person, that American families who are pro-life shouldn't be supporting, health insurance companies that aren't using their premium dollars to ultimately serve their families in a way that aligns with their values. So that's really at its core. Both Bob and I, as we're both professing Catholics, fundamentally to us is building something that actually promotes God's creative order in a space where really all of these abortion issues ultimately come through, which is the medical space.
So how should conservatives, going sort of a 30,000 foot view, how should conservatives, Catholics, Christians, people on the right understand the healthcare industry in the U.S.?
The biggest legislation that's shaped healthcare in the past, since Medicare, has been Affordable Care. And I think it's important to understand, at least for like setting the foundation for this conversation, because that everything you just talked about is by Affordable Care Act and is because of, in a lot of ways, the Affordable Care Act. So Affordable Care Act is the largest piece of legislation. It's impacted, it's defining healthcare right now since 1965. It was passed in 2010. Part of that was a federal mandate that requires health insurers and employers offering coverage to their employees to pay for contraceptive services, which include abortifacient. So person and every American that's buying health insurance, their premiums are funding abortifacients, contraceptive services. That's why. So that's the important 20,000 foot view. If you're looking at healthcare, you need to understand that unless you've really gone out of your way, or you work for an employer who's really gone out of their way, like the Hobby Lobbies of the world, your premium dollars are paying for these services that contradict Christian values.
So Obamacare mandated that those services be included in every healthcare plan, every insurance plan. Even if you're not using it, you're still paying for that to be part of the system.
There are a couple of narrow caveats. Obamacare came out, had a couple narrow caveats for like church plans, right? And then the Little Sisters of the Poor sued, the Hobby Lobby, the Green family who runs the Hobby Lobby, they sued, and they got expansions to like widen up a little bit. And what we're trying to do with what we're building right now, if you're an individual and you're shopping for health insurance, there's literally nothing available for you that's actually health insurance that doesn't pay for these services, because the Hobby Lobby exemption doesn't get extended to the little guys, to individuals. It's for employers. So what we're trying to do is take the Hobby Lobby victory and take it to every single American so that you don't have to be forced to pay for something that doesn't compromise your values.
Yeah, and I think it's helpful too. I think this is an issue, like in general with conservatives. Like, I don't think that we've been able to properly articulate like what's a vision for healthcare in general. And part of the problem from my perspective is we really haven't been able to frame the issue of healthcare to begin with. So this is the reason why we ultimately ended up at a position where the federal government is dictating to every single health insurance company that they have to cover these things is because ultimately they believe in central planning. And I think conservatives haven't properly framed the fundamental problem of healthcare to begin with. And that's, I think, something that we need to do better and need to do better quickly before you get increased federal control. And I think this, being startup founders, like, has been kind of interesting to go through this process where we're in a venture space that is very, very focused on properly framing problems and solutions. And I think it's the number one place where American conservatives have failed, is properly framing what is the problem of healthcare in America, and how do we actually get to the solution. So venture capitalists force startup founders to say who you are, what you're doing, what's the problem, what's the solution, why does it matter now. And I think for good measure, because ultimately if they bet on the company, if you can't properly frame it and get the right solution, then it's going to be a losing bet long term, right? Unfortunately, in the political sphere, everybody is allowed to bet, uneducated voters including, right? So we get bad politicians, but ultimately politicians don't have to properly frame the problem of healthcare. And so what I think as kind of like a starting place for kind of understanding, how we got to this position in the first place, I think we first have to understand that conservatives have generally misframed the problem as, and what you'll hear from typical, political response to this is, Obamacare sucks. Healthcare is, complicated, inefficient. Healthcare is unaffordable. And that's usually how the problem is framed. But the problem with healthcare as its starting point that everyone needs to understand out of the gates is that the problem with healthcare, the main problem is ultimately a reaction to the reality that healthcare has become, in a sense, miraculous in terms of what we can do. And from the pro-life position, a great example of that is, in Alabama, there was a 21-week-old baby that was saved. And,
born super early.
Like a premature,
extremely premature. Yeah.
A premature baby, an incredible, and so
that's like half term. I mean, a week above half term.
Yeah. So out of the 21 weeks, this is the record in the world happened in Alabama. And if you think about from the pro-life element, that really speaks to the reality that we have a healthcare system that can save a child in the womb. It costs a ton of money to do that. You're talking multiple month stays in the NICU. You're talking all of the medical advancements that you need to save this baby. Obviously, speaking to the dignity of the baby, we have a responsibility to do that. But this could be $1 million of a cost for saving a child. Mm-hmm. Or if you think about if you go into an accident, your daughter's in a car accident and, airlifted to a hospital, and you spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to save your daughter. All of these things that we ultimately can do because of medical advancements, but cost a ton of money to do it. So what the foundational problem in healthcare is that we have gotten to an advanced stage to the point that we can do miraculous things that nobody can ultimately afford. Mm-hmm. So that's the foundational problem with healthcare, is how do you pay for some of these services that are incredible, that reflect the medical advancements in society? And how do you spread that cost? Which the natural reaction has been insurance. So insurance is kind of the private market response to the problem of healthcare. So I think it has to be first emphasized that we're totally off the boat in terms of what the problem is. It's more of we're reacting to what central planners have done, where it's okay, Obamacare is bad. It's just a reaction to a solution from one side of the aisle, as opposed to properly framing the problem as, how do you spread risk in the private market that's insurance? And then what do you do with the 20% of Americans that can't afford to actually join those types of programs? And that's fundamentally what the issue is in healthcare. So 80% of people are going to be able to afford the spreading of risk through like a private market insurance product. 20% are not going to be, but do we have a moral obligation to ultimately take care of those 20%? Are we going to say first, before we save your 21-week-old baby, show me your ability to pay? So I think that we need to grapple with the fact that this is the problem that we have to solve. And every single federal policy flows from that problem. And you only have one side that sees like, here's a solution, is more government, more centralized control, right? We want Medicare for all. We want everybody to be ultimately covered, right? We want, Medicaid, Medicare, a federal program to cover people over 65, right? So the solution to that problem on one side has been centralized planning of an economy, essentially. There are other solutions that are free market based, but have to be around that situation of how do we have free market solutions? How do we maintain the concept of subsidiarity or federalism, the idea that you should solve things at the lowest level possible? If the state can do it, don't let the federal government get involved. If a family can do it, don't let the state government get involved. How do we solve the American healthcare system understanding this problem? And I bring this all to explain how we got to this point and why it's a problem for solving things at the federal level. Obamacare is the case study for why centrally planned things are not only wrong from like an efficiency standpoint, it's incredibly expensive, Obamacare. It's incredibly problematic from an inefficient standpoint, true, but it's central planning is always a problem more from the moral element, because as soon as you have a centrally planned problem or solution to a problem, the problem being how do we ultimately have people get access to life-saving care, which is a real problem we need to solve. If the answer is the federal government, which is one side says yes, you see exactly what ultimately happens is a few people then get to control an entire nation's healthcare system. And that's what Obamacare was. And they weaponized it for something which is somewhat marginal. They weaponized it to say, okay, we're going to run this entire federal program, and now we're going to tell every single health insurance product in the nation that you have to cover contraception, you have to cover abortifacients, right? And so I think like what we're doing is trying to solve things at the private market with, within the context of what the environment is on a federal and state policy level. But I also think it's very important to understand that, ultimately what the problem is in healthcare, and as kind of a movement that believes in free markets, properly articulating and framing that problem to the American people and then offering an alternative to a centrally planned environment is the only way you're going to avoid ultimately more and more of these types of controls, because
there's only offer. We need an offer from single payer at this point. It feels like.
Yeah.
I mean, if we keep going this direction, we need to offer a counter to Obamacare that solves the actual problem, articulates the issues you're saying.
Right. What do you guys think that looks like? We've gotten to the point where maximum centralization, it feels like, as an outsider to the industry, maximum centralization, top-down control, it feels very intimidating, like a lost cause. What are the paths that you see there to go localize that and decentralize it?
Yeah. My favorite simplistic type of switching from the federal government covering everybody and having you pay taxes to then them price control and so on and so forth, to exactly what happened in the retirement business, from defined benefit or pensions to 401k or defined contribution. So my view, and this is, I think that as we mature, maybe as a movement on healthcare, there can be obviously different types of solutions, but one way is to empower people to participate in the free market with essentially like a voucher. So in the healthcare industry, this is called the defined contribution model. It's pretty much the idea of like 401ks for health insurance. So the idea that, your employer right now will purchase coverage for you. Well, there's been a slow movement to then create tax incentives for employers to instead give you a voucher to ultimately purchase your own insurance. So then as you go throughout your life cycle as an employee in different environments. You learn to actually buy your own insurance. You learn to actually hold and possess your own insurance. It empowers people. It's kind of a small moving train at this point, but you can think things forward and say like, okay, you know, instead of Medicare, take Medicare. And this is where like, I find like conservatives are extremely schizophrenic. They're like, I hate Obamacare, but I love Medicare. Even though Medicare is like way more of a socialist program than Obamacare. Obamacare is like kind of the most free market system, believe it or not, that we have amongst the major markets. But if you think of Medicare, they tax you 3% or whatever, you know, you get taxed 3%, your employer pays 3%, and then they just collect it into a big fund, and then you're 65 and they cover you and pay you, right? I think if you were to train Americans to think the same way they think about retirement and through 401ks and say, how about instead you have some type of tax advantage where you contribute to your own account that you have, even your employer can pitch into an account, and now you have your actual money that you can go and purchase, you know, free market coverage by the time you're 65, and let states regulate markets downstream. That's one alternative, just to throw out like the idea of ultimately, and I think
this is fun. Let's play around with this because this is a fun exercise, because you've got the principle of subsidiarity is huge here. Like why do we become so desensitized to this? So I think it's helpful to bring up and just think through. Our employers are making decisions about what health plan is best for our family. Why? Like why don't we we have a system, right? So that's kind of the why. But like, can we break away from that system where it's like, I, Bob Hogan, know what's best for my family. I should be able to go out and shop and figure out what plan is best for my family. And then I'm not beholden to that coverage when I leave my employer in 3 years. And then my insurance company is incentivized to invest in me to keep me healthy, to keep me out of the hospital in 10 years down the road, because there's portability there. And my insurance company goes with me, change employer, rather than the current system, which is, hey, Bob Hogan just joined our plan. He's going to be gone in 3 years. I'm not too worried about him. We'll offload him onto another insurance company, right? No, I want to get behavioral health on the docket for Bob Hogan because behavioral health has proven outcomes and it reduces our overall costs, and we want to keep Bob healthy because that, you know, there's an incentive.
Yeah, it's sort of like a pit stop model right now where at every level you're transacting with, you know, you join a company, you have to choose one of three options that some bureaucrat in that company negotiated maybe 5 years before you joined. And if you don't like any of those options, too bad. You got to choose one of those. And then you leave and you'll have to go through the same process again at the next employer and the next employer and the next employer. There's literally no long-term.
Right. And the world is not the same as it was 40 years ago, right? Both of our fathers, I don't know about you guys, worked for the same organization for 40 plus years. Mm-hmm. And so in that world, there's no problem. Like you get all the benefits you're describing, but now you have people switching jobs every 2-3 years, you know, at best.
Yeah. So, go ahead.
No, just, you're exactly right. There's no long-term incentive for health insurers to manage care or manage your health. If you're going to leave in 4 or 5 years, like totally, there's no incentive there.
That also seems to, and I recall at some point talking with you guys about this, it also, maybe you can use the right words, but this is how I kind of remember thinking about it. The system also has to account for, unfortunately, a group, let's say even in your employer's plan, a group of people that will not prioritize their health, that will go out of their way to just live destructive lives, whether it's through abortions and certainly other ways. And if you take care of yourself, if you try to eat well and exercise or whatever, too bad, you end up having to, part of your premium ends up having to go subsidize an enormous amount of people that just don't care about their health. So when did you guys start thinking about doing this? About kind of, I mean, you're veterans of the insurance industry. Tell me about your backgrounds, and then when did you start thinking like, maybe there's something we should do here?
I'll start, kid. This is your brainchild. So my background is a healthcare lawyer. So I did a lot of representation of health systems, providers. I did a lot of private equity work for private equity clients, buying up, you know, mostly provider groups and that sort of thing. And I think, you know, just from having that experience and seeing just even through like M&A work and doing diligence on companies and seeing the payer contracts come through and negotiating what a provider's compensation package is going to look like going forward, appreciating how much leverage and power the insurers have over the whole system. I mean, you talk about healthcare as a $4 trillion industry in the United States. How much actually trickles down to the provider? Not so much. It all funnels through the payers, whether it's federal payers or private payers. That full $4 trillion goes to the payers first, and then they get to dole it out and say, here's how I want you to, here are the metrics I want you to hit, so you get your paycheck, right? So they have an incredible amount of power and control. So for me, that was sort of, I mean, that and, being asked to work on, like, I remember, I was at a big firm, and it was very prestigious, and we landed Planned Parenthood as a pro bono client. We're doing, so prestigious law firm doing free work for the world's largest provider of abortions. And, thank God I didn't have to do any work, and I made my faith and my position known, among my colleagues, and they were very respectful. But just seeing that, like, wow, like, this is we're doing meaningful work. We could be serving, a culture of life and building a culture of life. And instead, I think a lot of the industry is going, unfortunately, the opposite direction. So, like, can we do something better? And then, Dan, you talk about this being your brainchild. You have a beautiful story.
Well, I feel like it's the same. I've heard you guys were sharing your story right before this. Like, I think it's almost like a similar pattern for a lot of people. But my story starts as an actuary. I was, working as a consultant on the West Coast for health insurance companies. It was a very distinct moment for me where I was at a prayer event with my family. We had the bishop come out. It was a beautiful event. It was called a May crowning. So we're celebrating, Mary, Queen of Heaven, really a worship of Christ as King of the universe. And right after the prayer event, going home, check my email, and the first thing I see is an email from a client saying, Daniel, you need to calculate the cost of abortion for our health plan, which I was doing their rate filing for at the time. And so it was this very clear, distinct, like, gut punch moment of, like, you're not living coherently with your faith. Like, you're saying you believe that Jesus Christ is king, but you're ultimately working and participating in evil through your actuarial work. And for me, it was, I told my wife, like, all right, I'm done. Like, I can't do, but we got kids and stuff. So we tried to discern, like I was able to tell the client at the time my beliefs and said, like, listen, I'm contracted to do this. I'm going to, out of justice, like, I will, but I want you to know, like, I don't believe in abortion. I think it's murder. But from that point forward, I was basically in this discernment process of, like, how do you take me out of the evil side of healthcare, but ultimately use me for something, true, good, beautiful. And so through that process, I got to know, like, the health sharing ministry world. We worked for, one of our clients was MediShare, and we got to see kind of the ins and outs of this alternative to healthcare, that was certainly pro-life and aligned with the values, but I got to see multiple, kind of different organizations, and some that were not funded well. And these are organizations that don't have any regulations around them. So if they don't have the money to pay medical bills, they don't pay your medical bills. And so it was this realization for me that ultimately Christian families don't have an option that they can trust. And I put it in terms of me as a father, like, would I go on a health share? And my response was no, because I don't know whether or not, when it comes to, like, if my kid is in the NICU, I can't guarantee that that's $1 million check is going to come through. And for me, like, as a father, that's the primary purpose of insurance. Like, I'm here to protect all the hard work that I'm doing. So the fact that it didn't exist, the fact that, God kind of drew me into, kind of seeing the evil side of healthcare was the calling card to say, okay, this Obamacare has been in place for some years. We need to have a faith-based health insurance company that's actually great. Like, we can't have it's almost like back in the 90s or whatever it was, when there was, like, some Christian entertainment that wasn't that great. Right. But it's like, everyone wants it. Right. Yes. Everyone wants something, right? But it's not great. And now you can see, like, now you're starting to have, like, great, there's The Chosen, and people are fanatical about it. And that's my ultimate view was, there's no reason why we can't have something that's pro-life, building the culture of life that is not also great, and that me as a father would go on to. So that was my like initiation to say, all right, let's do this. Bob was like we're both homeschool dads, so like we were in like a men's and by homeschool dads I mean our wives homeschool. We just the principals of the house, maybe whatever you call it. they're the real workhorses behind the homeschool life. But knew he was a good faithful Catholic. So I was like, all right, I told him I need a lawyer. This is health insurance. We're going to be like the first like actual health insurance company as a religious entity. Like, we're going to need actuary lawyer. So we teamed up and it's been a blessing ever since just to.
We have a lot of fun, the actuary and lawyer.
The two most interesting occupations.
When I grow up, I want to be an actuary.
But I remember like you pitched the idea to me and my first reaction was like, yeah, I don't think you can do that. I'm pretty sure that's illegal. Cause I mean, the current landscape in America, like it does make it very challenging. And there's a reason nobody's done this before.
So aside from all the values alignment stuff, the fact that it's faith-based, pro-life, so there's also a lot of innovative aspects to the cost, the benefits, the way you guys actually implement the product. So it's not just pro-life, cool, but it's also innovation and at the product level. Can you guys talk about that?
Yeah, we probably have to tee up the non-ACA space for a second.
Sure.
I don't know if you want to tee that up.
Sure.
For the non-ACA.
So, okay, again, back to historical backdrop here. When the Affordable Care Act drops, there were two big prongs of it that were really contentious in addition to the contraceptive mandate. One was called the individual mandate and one was called guarantee issue. And they kind of worked together. And the idea was we want to get everybody into one risk pool because right now we've got really healthy individuals, young kids out of college, and they're just skipping on insurance because they don't need it. They're invincible, right? Or so they think. And most of the times, like, that's fine. They have no major issues, but that leaves everybody else in these risk pools who are buying insurance. It means the risk pool gets like polluted. It's a worse risk pool. It's more expensive to insure. So they wanted to get a way of getting these healthy kids into the risk pool so that everybody's the idea was like a floating tide. What is it? Floating tide rises all ships. Right. Thank you. And at the same time, we have these unhealthy people that are really hard to insure. So they wanted to have guarantee issue for them, which means you apply for a policy, you're guaranteed to get issue a policy, right? So the idea behind all that is to get everybody into a single risk pool. While that's happening, there were a couple of alternative marketplaces developing. And there were three primary markets I'll talk about. One was these health shares that we've kind of brought up. They're not legally health insurance. They're usually a band of Christian folks who are getting together and they decide to pay each other's healthcare costs. They're financially risky, but they are pro-life. And those were like a write-out in the Affordable Care Act. If you're part of these healthcare sharing ministries, you're not subject to the individual mandate penalty, which wound up being a tax, which wound up being reduced to zero under the Trump administration. So that's exception number one. Exception number two was what's called short-term limited duration products. I'm probably going too far into detail on these, but short-term limited duration were initially designed as like gap measures for people that lose their job. They need insurance after COBRA or instead of COBRA to get them through the next open enrollment period. Insurers sort of exploited that and said, okay, let's try to make these for longer. Let's try to make these actually replacements for comprehensive Affordable Care Act coverage. They're not subject to all the Affordable Care Act requirements. This was like a political volume. The Democrats are always like, we need to narrow these markets and availability of short term. Republicans are always like, we need to expand this because it's our only option apart from Affordable Care Act coverage. So the Biden administration just basically eviscerated that whole marketplace last month. So the third marketplace, the third option or alternative to Affordable Care Act coverage is what's called accepted benefits policies. These are policies AFLAC cancer-only policy. Cancer-only policy. The Affordable Care Act is not really concerned about that. If you're going out for a fixed indemnity policy for a hospital visit, Affordable Care Act is not really concerned about that. So these those are like the three major categories: fixed indemnity, accident, and specified disease policies, like a cancer policy. They're not regulated by the.
So taking that concept of the continuum of care is you're sick, you have an accident, and maybe you want some like wellness coverage. Each of these three individually aren't regulated by the Affordable Care Act. You can package these ultimately as a bundle, which allows you to only accept healthy membership as one example. So get around that whole guaranteed issue. So if you're healthy, you're truly buying insurance for something that you can't predict is going to happen, you can be enrolled in that plan. If you're not healthy and you're currently under cancer treatment, you go to the Obamacare market. So this is a fundamentally healthy block of business, which makes it more competitive from a cost perspective to say like your Blue Cross Blue Shield Obamacare product, right? So what we're trying to do is ultimately start in a place that allows us to be a lot more cost effective than the major players. And this is something that is extremely important to understand from like the startup world. So we had three major startups that were venture backed, Friday Health Plans, Bright, Oscar. They raised billions of dollars, and they basically took the approach of saying, let's go into the Obamacare markets. And they got eviscerated because the way that insurance ultimately works is that 80% of your cost is medical, 20% is administrative and profit. That 80% is based on your relationships with hospitals. It's, can you contract a rate that's, competitive? Mm-hmm. There's no way to start from the ground zero to say, if you go to the hospital, go to Baylor and say, give us the same rate as United. It's not going to happen if you have 0 members and United has all, Yeah. So it's a total competitive disadvantage that essentially the health tech world, who had like the administrative piece is what they were focusing on. They didn't focus on the 80% cost piece, and they blew up essentially. So what we're trying to do is do this prudentially, where you're going into a market that is fundamentally different from the Obamacare market, that allows for healthier members to compete on day one on cost, so that we can be competitive on premium, but also grow profitably, so that as you gain membership, as you gain traction, as you gain more leverage to ultimately contract on par with the larger insurers, you can then start to expand into different markets. So the innovation is really understanding that there is a niche alternative to the Affordable Care Act, and aggressively going after that market to have a better value proposition than health shares, so that you can ultimately leverage that to then go into other markets that are a lot more restrictive in terms of the margins that you're allowed to build into them. So that's primarily, I would say like the product strategy is a innovation that this is part of my work at a former company out here in Texas that helped build these type of products and was very successful. So it's taking that model, baptizing it, and bringing it to the Christian families.
And then another innovation that you alluded to is like so that's initial product that we just described is outside of the Affordable Care Act landscape. Then we want to get into the Affordable Care Act landscape. So if you have a family member that has a pre-existing condition, is for some reason unhealthy, we want to be able to welcome them too. And that's through the Affordable Care Act marketplaces, where it is a guarantee issue product. The way we do that is through a 2018 exemption to the contraceptive mandate under the Affordable Care Act. So we can actually get into those marketplaces. Nobody's done this. We don't know why. We talked to the woman who wrote the regulation, and she was like, you guys are exactly the reason why we wrote this. Nobody's done this so far. People have kind of danced around it. Little known exemption. So we're excited to we're the first in history to file an application to be a religious insurer. We've done that here in the state of Texas, and we're excited to see where that takes us.
Yeah. So let's talk about launch. As people listen to this and they decide, this sounds like something I want to use for my family. What's your launch process? Where are you starting? And then where are you scaling from there?
Yeah, we've made great inroads here in Texas with the Department of Insurance. So Texas is our launch state. So obviously a large market, obviously very friendly to religious freedom. That's the main reason why we've chosen Texas as the launch market. So our goal is to get a product out there by September of this year. We are working with multiple kind of strategic ways to get beyond just Texas out of the gates. So ideally, Florida, Southwest, Midwest, some of the states that you can imagine are a little bit more friendly to a faith-based health insurer. We like to get that product as fast as we can to the marketplace. So it's just a matter of ultimately hitting the compliance check marks from an operations standpoint. We'll be ready to go essentially this summer. So right now, we've been building a wait list through our website, prolife.health. You can go and sign up on that wait list. And that really helps us kind of build traction towards this momentum and get this product close to the finish line. And then as soon as we're available in people's states, we'll contact them. We'll be letting people know state by state as we ultimately unlock it. But really this is, long-term vision is as many states as possible. There's no reason why a faith-based health insurance company can't or should be barred in this society in America from truly offering in any single state. And so that's our goal, is how many states, how fast can we do it, and just hitting the targets from compliance wise to get there.
That's awesome. Good stuff, guys. We'll link the sign up to the waitlist in the show notes, site, everything there, and look forward to seeing this launch at the end of the summer. So
we're excited for it.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Totally.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the New Founding Podcast. New Founding has become a rallying point for founders and investors who are taking serious bets in the face of a stagnant business culture. Our venture fund backs founders building dynamic companies, powered by American ideals and a positive national vision. These are the kinds of founders that embody the optimism and competence of the people who come on this podcast. If you're interested in investing in our fund, check out newfounding.com/venture fund and follow the link to apply.